My name is Charles Gallagher. I'm an NHS doctor in emergency medicine in London, and I've worked in the NHS for about 7 years. So I was a Lexit or left exit voter, but I've since become convinced that Brexit would be a disaster for the UK and for the NHS in particular. Lots of the Lexit arguments against the EU still stand. The EU is not democratic in any meaningful way. It has imposed austerity on struggling member states. It has taken the side of big business against trade unions, and it has contributed to a race to the bottom in paying conditions for low-paid workers. Although I think it's become clear now that people on low incomes will be even worse off if we Brexit. I mean, even now we have seen a significant fall in household incomes just since the referendum, and Brexit hasn't even happened. And that squeeze on incomes is affecting people on lowest incomes proportionately more.
So what was it then that prompted you to change your mind?
I mean, people campaigning for Brexit, I think, genuinely believed that the UK would be better off outside of the European Union. But I think since the referendum, we've had a torrent of evidence to the contrary. The NHS was a huge battleground in the referendum campaign, with both Remain and Leave both claiming that the NHS would be better off either in or out of the EU. But I think since then that argument has been decisively won by Remain. First of all, if we want to build a great NHS, we need people to want to work in it. And Brexit has been a disaster for recruitment and retention of NHS workers from the EU. 5.6% of NHS workers come from non-UK EU countries, and that increases to 7% of nurses and 10% of doctors. Since the referendum, we've seen a fall in applications to work in the UK from EU nurses of more than half, and a BMA survey last year showed that nearly half of EU doctors were considering leaving the UK in the wake of the referendum. Now, for an organisation like the NHS with 100,000 vacancies, this is dire news. But the loss of a single EU healthcare worker is a huge loss for them, for their colleagues, and for their patients. The number one determinant of the amount of money available for the NHS is obviously tax revenue. And we now know that Brexit will result in tax revenue being far less in any Brexit scenario. So even if we take the softest possible Brexit, we stay within the single market, we're still looking at a £17 billion a year hole in the public finances by 2033. If we take a slightly harder Brexit and we seek a trade deal with the EU, then that hole in the public finances is raised to between 40 and 57 billion pounds. And then if we exit on WTO terms, that figure rises to 81 billion pounds a year. These sums are astronomical. And if you bear in mind that the total NHS budget for a year is only 125 billion pounds, I genuinely believe that Brexit would result in the end of the NHS as we know it. I mean, there's no other way to square the circle. And there are other problems as well. So, for example, long waits for new drugs. I don't think many people were cognizant of this before the referendum, but a report that came out earlier this year suggested that we could be looking at waits for new medications compared to other EU countries of up to a year. And if you're waiting for a new cancer drug, that's pretty scary stuff. Already we're feeling the negative impact on research. So I think the idea, which you alluded to earlier, that the NHS would be better off following Brexit, I think is clearly has been completely blown out of the water.
Do you think when people voted for Brexit that they realised what these consequences could be?
I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, you know, did any of us vote to make the UK significantly poorer, to irredeemably damage public services and the welfare budgets? I mean, I know that I didn't. And the only way to right the wrong of being misled by the Leave campaign, whatever their intentions, is to have a people's vote on the final Brexit deal.
To have another referendum?
Exactly. So in autumn 2018, the government will be presented with the final Brexit deal, and then they will vote on whether or not to accept that deal. And the People's Vote campaign is urging MPs to reject that deal, and that should then trigger a people's vote on the final Brexit deal, with the option of remaining in the European Union on the ballot paper. We have to persuade our MPs to vote against that deal. So you can email your MP, it's very easy. If you Google Best for Britain Demand Your Vote, click on the first link that comes up, and you just put in your postcode, a few clicks, and you can send a pre-filled email to your MP demanding a people's vote. Another thing you can do that would be hugely helpful is attend the March for a People's Vote. Now this is on Saturday the 23rd of June 2018, so 2 years after the date of referendum, and this will be the biggest ever march in defiance of Brexit. And everyone who's able to attend that march is sending a really strong message to Parliament that we're not prepared to accept a Brexit catastrophe.
There is an argument, though, that it would be undemocratic to have another referendum, given that we've already had one.
I mean, I think to a health professional, I think the idea that consent for something such as Brexit can't change is ridiculous. If you decided to have an operation, you can decide not to have that operation up until the minute you go under your anaesthetic. And to say that because we had one vote, which was not an informed vote, means that we have to go on, just plough on regardless with Brexit, is ridiculous. I mean, I think the will of the people has changed. Polls haven't shown a huge shift, but if you speak to people anecdotally, there's huge kind of disbelief at what's happening, regret at having voted Leave. And it's like with the referendum campaign, the polls were proved wrong right up until the result came through. And I think, I think the reality is that Britain does not want Brexit anymore. We didn't give our consent for a Brexit at any cost.